Hello and welcome to the second part of our introduction to the course on Frank Lloyd Wright. In this lecture, we'll speak about Frank Lloyd Wright's biography, and we'll start with his early life. Frank Lloyd Wright was born in 1867 and lived for 91 years, so he started at just a few years after the Civil War, and this time certainly impacted his life. So I wanted to ask John, what was the influence of the time and of the epoch and of the culture of that time to Frank Lloyd Wright's life and early career?
So we're going to have a lot to cover here, 91 years. So we're going to do his biography in three parts, and they're all brief, but we really need a feel for that to understand the work. And Wright's life was extremely rich in fortunate things and misfortunate things. The woman he loved was murdered, but and also the source of a lot of fiction. So Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead is loosely based on Frank Lloyd Wright. Not so much biographically, but on the defiance of the individual. So Wright was born in a little farming village of Richmond Center, and we are lucky to have a postcard of it, and it gives a sense of the bucolic farming America. Most people were farmers, and that's the world he's born into. Now he's also Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson died when Wright was 15. So Emerson was not a historical figure for Wright. He was a contemporary. He's somebody he would have, read. So this Emersonian American transcendentalism was very much absorbed by Wright. He was very much brought up by his mother. His father was an itinerant preacher, music teacher, and Wright's mother threw him out when Wright was 14. He just could never hold down a job. And the mother, Anna Lloyd Jones, was a school teacher, very strong woman. She decided Wright was going to be an architect. So she hung in her bedroom images of Gothic cathedrals and bought him what's called Froebel blocks. And so these are children toys. Think of like Lego blocks today. And we can see the influence of these geometric forms of these blocks on Wright. And it led Wright at an early age to be able to think spatially. He was able to absorb spatial thinking as a language. We learn language when we're very young. It's difficult to learn a new language when you're older. Wright went to school only for a year and then went to Chicago and went to work eventually for the architect Louis Sullivan. The firm is Adler and Sullivan, who were the hottest revolutionary architects in this new Chicago style. There are other major architects who were more, say, establishment, but Sullivan was the radical architect, the one you wanted to work for if you wanted to also make a mark. Wright referred to Sullivan as his Liebermeister, dear master. And Wright became the hot young architect in Chicago. Everybody knew who he was. And he got fired from Sullivan for what's called the bootleg houses. He had 6 kids. He had very expensive tastes, very expensive horses and later cars. And so he was always in debt. And so he was doing houses at night off the kitchen table. Not supposed to do that when you're in an office. And he got fired. Wright worked on Sullivan's most important building, the Wainwright building. Talk a little bit about that when we get to the Chicago School. Wright married Catherine Kitty Tobin Wright. She was a social worker and socialite. They had 6 children, a really rich life. But then in 1909, Wright, after 20 years, leaves her and runs off with another woman. This is a house he built for himself and his wife, and we'll go into this in some detail, but we can see from the plan it keeps growing as his family grows. His office is also part of the house, and he then runs off with the wife of a client, Mama Cheney, and they go to Europe and come back and are staying in Taliesin, and Wright builds sort of a compound for him and her. out in family land out in Wisconsin. And while Wright was at a job in Chicago, a servant went berserk, set the place on fire, and murdered Mama Cheney and her 2 children. So very tragic for Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, just to get a feel for the time, this is a house Wright does in 1900, 1902, the Ward Willett House. Very important. We'll look at it some more. And look at this car. We can see it's a Mercedes-Benz nestled into the driveway. Very much fits there. But this is what a car would have looked like when Wright designed that house.
Amazing.
So, yeah, it's like, what was the world like? This extremely modern house that we would think of it as a modern house today. But this is what an automobile looked like at that time. So, summing up, there are, again, hundreds of books about Wright, and just go through them online, see which ones you might be interested in. But for a biography of Wright, an extremely powerful and moving book Wright wrote in the 30s, an autobiography, Frank Lloyd Wright. And that's a must-read if you're really a student of this period of American history. But if you just want to get a sketch of an overview of Wright's life, there's a wonderful little book by Ada Louise Huxtable, famous for being the first architectural critic of any American newspaper. She was at the New York Times. And it's part of a series of biographies. It's a slim little book, so it gives you a brief overview of Wright's life, but also for every part of his life, she says, now, for when he went to Japan in 1905, here's the best book. Or for what, Taliesin was like, when he built it, here's the best book. So this will be a guide for reading other biographies about Frank Lloyd Wright. So here's some things to think about. Are you surprised by what the world was like in which Wright was growing up? If this guy does the Guggenheim Museum in the mid-20th century, what's it like that he was born in 1867?
All right.
So there's part 1 of our biography, and next we'll do part 2.